So, good morning, afternoon. At this point, we've discussed how the British established their 13 colonies and how each of them were very different from one another. Now that we have the British colonies established, we're going to talk about some conflict that starts to occur in North America. And it's all about power between the French and the Indians. So, again, as you're watching this video, make sure you're completing the guided notes. This video is probably going to be a little bit longer because the war is important, but not super important that we have to spend a lot of time on it. So, this little video and these notes are going to seem a little bit longer than the ones you've done so far. But that's okay. You can take your time, you can pause, rewind, anything that you need to do. So the French and Indian War became a conquest for land in North America. Okay, so our big lesson objective, this is 2.2, Unit 2, Lesson 2, is that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what led or caused the French and Indian War and the major events of the war. Your must-do assignments for 2.2 are the video and guided notes that you're doing right now, the practice, which is either a graphic organizer if you are in period 3 and period 5, or a reading if you're watching this in period 6, and the mastery check. There's also a should do lesson, which is an ed puzzle, and then an aspire to do current event connection at the end of this week. So in North America, by the time we get to about 1750, North America is divided between France, that you see here in yellow, is what land they have claimed. The British have claimed what's in green. And then south with Florida, what today is Arizona and New Mexico, and Mexico, as well as South America, is all considered part of Spain. So really the big battle is going to come between the British and the French. Native Americans, for their part, are going to be kind of caught in between these two. They'll be caught in between the French and the British. So even though the war is called the French and Indian War, the Native Americans are actually fighting on both sides. There were some that sided with the British and some that sided with the French. All of this takes place in the Ohio River Valley. Now, why is that? If you look here closely at the map, okay, you can see the Ohio River is basically right where these two colors meet. And this is going to be a big space that they're fighting over. They're fighting over land. They're fighting over trade. They're fighting over resources, riches. So all of this is going to come to conflict, which will be a war. So we're going to look at 3 separate reasons for the war. So on your guided reading notes, you're going to tell me what 2 things, how the fur trade caused the war, how fights over land caused the war, and then how Indian relations also led to war. So, as I think we kind of discussed in looking at some of the major industries for both the British and the French, is the fur trade. You'll see the animal on top there, that is a beaver. There were actually so many beavers in North America at this time that you could not go like feet in the woods without seeing a beaver. For the French, it became their earliest and most important industry in North America. Why did they want to have beaver? It was used to make hats, and they were the huge fashion in Europe. So think of a fashion today that is something that, everybody wants to have, whether it be like Jordans or Yeezys. Everyone in Europe wanted to have a beaver hat. Beaver were native to North America. No one had ever seen them in Europe before, so they kind of became the hot trend for people to wear, to like look rugged, like they had been to the New World. So beaver will become one of the causes of the French and Indian War, because a lot of the Ohio River Valley was where a lot of this beaver was hunted. So you had British hunters as well as French hunters and Native Americans all hunting for beaver fur. So you can see here, this is kind of what beaver fur looks like once you pelted the animal. And those traps that you see on the right is what would have been used. So the second major cause is land. Land in any place equals power. So land is another major cause. English colonists bought 500,000 acres of land in the Ohio Valley to farm. And obviously, this would come into direct conflict with the French fur trade because this is where the beavers lived. So, this brought conflict economically. They're fighting over land and resources. Also, religious conflict. At this time, the English were Protestant, they were Anglican. The French are predominantly Catholic. So, you had differing religions as well. And then also the political conflict going on between the two. So, for the French in North America, the land was originally claimed by French explorers, but the French fur traders used the Ohio River for fur trading. Along the Ohio River Valley, because this area was so important to trade, the French government built forts to stop the English from taking the land. And this is all going to come to a head when the two of them are fighting. The British, their colonies in the east continued to grow and make more money for them. So new people were constantly arriving and they were looking for more land. Land was free or cheap, which offered people new opportunity and economic freedom, leaving Europe and coming to North America. So, in response to the French building forts, the English also built forts and started to give land away to English citizens. One of the last major causes is the relationship between Native Americans. Traditionally, when the French start becoming, start gaining more land in the new world, they have a lot better relationships with the Native Americans. They worked with them peaceably, whereas the British were literally wanted to just kick Native Americans off of their land and use the land for farming, which is not typically how the natives use their land. Most of the French colonists that were here were fur traders, so they worked closely with the French. The French only wanted fur. They didn't want to stay on the land. They lived among Native Americans. They learned how to make canoes, how to trap animals, make snowshoes. They learned how to speak the language that Native Americans spoke. Also, some of the French traders married Native American women. So you have like the French that are kind of like melding into the life of the Native Americans, where the British were the opposite. They just wanted to take the land from the natives. So the French and Indian War officially begins with the English attacking the French at Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne is in the Ohio River Valley. The attack ultimately ends in disaster for the British, but it became the first battle of the French and Indian War. So the war, once it begins in 1754, is fought on two continents. There's fighting happening in North America, and there's fighting also happening in Europe. In America, the war was fought mostly in the Ohio River Valley, which at the time was the western frontier of the British colonies. That was as far west as they went. In Europe, France and England fought in what is known as the 7 Years' War, but it's the same exact war. It just has different names in different places. So for each side, there were different advantages. So we're going to write down in our guided notes the advantages that the British had. The British obviously had the help of Americans living in the 13 colonies, because they are British subjects at this time. And then the French also have advantages. So we're going to take down some notes on both of these parts. So you have on the left-hand side, the British has a larger population in North America. By this point, almost 1.5 million people were living in the 13 colonies, and the British expected that since this was caused by them moving into the Ohio River Valley, that Americans would definitely help. Another advantage is that because there was no set army at this time, the different colonies had their own militias. Which were groups of men that like would drill and would get ready just in case they were ready to fight. And they had been fighting Native Americans for over 100 years. The American colonies were very self-supporting. They produced enough food and supplies to keep the army going. The British also had the strongest navy in the world at this time. So the British control the seas. So those are the four major advantages of each side. So if you pause, make sure you write down those four things: larger population, militias, self-supporting, and the fact that Britain controlled the seas. On the French side of things, the French were a single colonial government. So one government meant less discussion. If you remember from your 13 colonies examination you did on the Google Slides the beginning of this week, it looked at how the different colonial regions had different types of government. Remember, there were three. And Americans didn't necessarily always listen to what the British were saying. The British, up to this point, had kind of left them alone. So the French were able to make a lot faster decisions. They also were settled very closely around each other. The pattern of settlement was a lot closer. Towns were closer together. They also had forts that were well built, built high on cliffs that kind of gave them an advantage as well. Okay. However, just like there were advantages, things that are good, there were also going to be things that weren't good, disadvantages. So we're going to have several of those as well. So the disadvantages for the British, the colonial assemblies, each colony jealously guarded its own power. The colonies kind of want to act independently, even though they're ruled by the British. And they're also fighting an offensive war, which means they have to do the attacking. If you think of war like sports, right? Offense versus defense. When you're playing defense, you're kind of sitting back and just trying to like defend yourself. Where if you're on the offense, like you're doing the attacking, right? So for the British, they're fighting an offensive war. They want to attack Quebec and Montreal. Those are the two largest French cities that are in North America at this time. So they need to attack those two places in order to win. The French disadvantages, much smaller population. So you can see the difference between 1.5 million to 75,000. 75,000 is about a third of the population of the people that live in the city of Worcester. So that's very small. So in order to be successful, they depended on imports, which if the British control the seas, not really going to be able to bring goods in through the ocean if the British have the ability to stop you. They didn't have a lot of troops. The French sent very few troops over. So the defense fell to the fur trading companies themselves, kind of learning how to be soldiers and learning how to take care of, fighting in battles. The other side of this, so again, you have the British and you have the French. You also have Native American involvement. And as I said at the beginning of the video, you'll have the British and the American allies fighting on the same side, fighting with the French and then also fighting with the British. So on the British and American side, you had the Iroquois League, which is based roughly around the Ohio River Valley, upstate New York. The chief of the Mohawks becomes a colonel in the British Army. The French, on the other hand, have the Algonquins, the Ottawas, and the Hurons. They had long time been trading partners with the French. They did not trust the fact that all the British were out for was for their land. So the war is actually going to last quite some time. And a lot of the battles, like you see in the picture here, are British troops, British militia, American militia fighting Native Americans on behalf of the French. It would be kind of very deadly and kind of ruthless fighting in the Ohio River Valley. So what happens at war, you can kind of see in the map here, again, the French are what's in green, the British are in tan. I think it's backwards from the last map, but that's okay. Just think of the places and you see on the map, like Quebec, Montreal, Huron, all of these are places that are French named, right? So you can see here is I can do my little pen. Here is the Ohio River Valley. Okay, the Ohio River is this whole region here. Okay, so that is where you're going to see a lot of your fighting, and you can see all the forts that the French have built throughout this time period. That's where we'll see a majority of our fighting. And then you have a major battle up here in Quebec, which will kind of be the turning point of the war. So again, the turning point battle of the war is going to be the Battle of Quebec. Okay. During the war, one significant thing that takes place is called the Albany Plan. So we're going to jot down a couple things about the Albany Plan and jot down a couple things about the Battle of Quebec. And as I said, it's a video, so if you feel like you need to stop and take a break, that's totally fine. Okay, so the Albany Plan was proposed by Benjamin Franklin. You might have heard of him before. He is the person that's on the $100 bill. This is the first time Ben Franklin kind of comes into the picture. Actually was born in Boston, served as a printing apprentice, and moves to Philadelphia. But during the French and Indian War, there's a meeting in Albany, New York, where representatives from each of the 13 colonies get together and they're like, you know what, guys, like we are all acting as separate places right now. We are all acting separately, and it would be really smart for us to maybe join together and kind of all fight against the French, or all, get together and like, be a united group. So this doesn't end up happening, okay? But it's really important because it's the first time that this idea is floated that potentially the 13 colonies could unite together as one. They were all formed by themselves. So this is kind of a like crazy idea that anyone would even say this. And this image that you're seeing here with the snake broken into pieces is very important, and becomes an important symbol once we do get to the American Revolution. So, as I said, the Albany Plan, 9 from 13 colonies meet that they should create a loose union that works together. The turning point battle comes in Quebec City. This is in 1759. The British come into the port of Quebec by sea and climb cliffs, surprise attacking them, and the French are caught off guard. The commanders of both sides actually die in the battle. The British claim victory, and the French admittedly surrender in America a year later. So the war ends, but it isn't totally over until the treaty that ends the war is signed. Whenever you have a war, you have to have a treaty once, the fighting is done. So in Paris, a treaty is signed in 1763, which officially ends the war. And as part of this, France actually surrenders all land that they have claim to in North America to Great Britain. So finally, the results of the war, or the effects, right? So we had things leading up to the war itself, and then the effects, or results, what happens after. Britain now has control over half of the North American continent, including French Canada, all French territorial claims, everything east of the Mississippi River, and Spanish Florida. Another result of the war is, remember, the British is fighting with the American colonists. The British decide that it's time for them to reevaluate their relationship with the colonies. The colonies were kind of acting as though they were independent and not under British rule, and weren't very helpful when it came to the war. So the British are like, basically, our little, colonial like children are acting out of line, and it's time for us to reestablish control and re-put them back in their place and take back over, because they are our colonies. So we have the ability to make laws. The British government is also facing financial problems. The war is expensive. They owed a lot of money. So the debt from the country is going to soar. If you have debt, you need to pay debt back. So they're going to have to come up with some ways to make back some money to pay for the debt that happened as a result of the war. So one of the first things they do, and this is the last slide for today, and we'll talk more about this slide in our next lesson next week, is they establish what's known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. Basically, they say, even though that we just got all this new land from France, you cannot move there. We cannot control the Native American population. We cannot protect you. So you cannot go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And the proclamation said Native Americans own those lands, and white settlers are going to be removed back east towards the coast. So we shall see whether or not that's something that the colonists are going to be very happy to follow. Again, make sure you look over the guided notes. If you have questions, please let me know, and you will have practice and a mastery check on this topic.